He laughed at her prosthetic leg and declared she had no place on the runway. But that night, one broken step would shatter his empire of perfection and redefine the meaning of beauty forever. The backstage of the casting hall was not a place for the faint-hearted. Bright lights stabbed through the mirrors, designer gowns shimmered on hangers, and the air itself seemed perfumed with ambition and pride. Every corner echoed with the clatter of high heels and the clipped voices of assistants who moved with military precision. In this glittering chaos, only one figure held dominion: Adrian, the legendary designer. His reputation was carved from brilliance and cruelty, alike an artist who believed beauty meant perfection, and perfection meant conformity. He stood in the center of the room, tall and immaculately dressed, his eyes scanning the line of models with a predator's detachment. One crooked posture, one trembling hand, one imperfection, and they would be dismissed with a wave as cold as winter steel. For Adrian, the runway was sacred ground, and only flawless beings were worthy to walk upon it. And then she appeared. The room shifted when I stepped inside, though no one could quite say why at first. She was young, her face lit with an inner light, her presence oddly unshakable. Yet as her gown brushed against the polished floor, a collective silence spread like wildfire. Eyes fell not on her beauty, but on her leg, or rather, on the absence of it. Beneath the hem of her dress, the gleam of a prosthetic limb caught the merciless glare of the spotlight. For a heartbeat, time fractured. Conversation stopped. Assistants froze mid-step. Even the model's creatures bred to ignore everything but their reflection turned, their expressions oscillating between shock and curiosity. Mai's hands clutched the fabric she carried, knuckles white, but her gaze never wavered. She stood at the threshold of a world that had never been designed to include her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear though it trembled at the edges. "I'd like to try on the dress. I want to walk." The words seemed to crack against the walls, louder than any music. A simple request, but in this place, it was an act of rebellion. Adrian's head turned slowly, as though insulted that he even had to acknowledge her. His eyes, sharp and merciless, narrowed on the girl before him. A low, humorless chuckle escaped his lips, and the room braced for the cruelty they all knew was coming. "This runway," he said, his tone slicing through the silence, "is not a stage for pity. We do not parade charity. We create beauty, perfection, and you." His gaze flicked downward, lingering on her prosthetic leg with deliberate disdain. "You do not belong here." The words detonated in the air. Gasps fluttered across the room. One model dropped her phone. Another assistant lowered her clipboard, horrified. But Adrian did not flinch. His pronouncement was final, as absolute as a verdict handed down from a judge, and yet, amid the wreckage of humiliation he had unleashed, Mai did not collapse. Her shoulders straightened. Her breathing steadied. Something in her eyes, something fierce and unbreakable, flared to life. In that suspended moment, the balance of power shifted, though few realized it yet. What Adrian had intended as mockery began to reveal itself as a challenge, and the girl he sought to crush had already decided she would not retreat. The air was so heavy you could almost hear it humming. What would she do? What could she do, standing alone against a man whose name was synonymous with power and whose empire could erase her existence with a word? The answer, though still hidden, was inevitable, because sometimes the most explosive revolutions are born not from grand speeches or mighty armies, but from a single fragile voice daring to say, "I want to walk," and that voice, echoing in the silence of the casting hall, was about to change everything. If this moment already shakes you, imagine what will unfold when defiance collides with arrogance, and when a girl the world tried to erase demands her place beneath the brightest lights. Stay with this story until the end, and you'll witness not just fashion, but a transformation that will haunt you long after the last word. If you want more stories that uncover hidden battles and reveal the extraordinary power of resilience, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support is the reason we can continue creating videos that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Now, let me ask you something. If you were in that casting room, faced with Mai's request, what would you have done? Tell her she doesn't belong, because rules are rules and perfection cannot be compromised. Give her the chance, because true beauty is not about flawless bodies, but about courage and spirit. Comment your answer below with "Will be." I'm waiting to see where your heart stands. The room was still buzzing with the echo of Adrian's words when Mai moved toward the rack of gowns. She did not argue. She did not beg. In silence, she selected a dress, a piece of satin and sequins that shimmered like liquid light. Assistants watched with wide eyes, unsure whether to stop her or step aside. Adrian stood unmoving, arms crossed, certain that her attempt would collapse under its own weight. But Mai's hands, though trembling slightly, fastened the gown with steady determination. When she stepped into the center of the backstage hall, the change was undeniable. The dress cascaded around her, hugging her frame with elegance that seemed almost defiant. She did not hide the prosthetic leg beneath layers of fabric. It gleamed under the harsh lights, stark, unapologetic, and strangely beautiful. Her first step was awkward. The sound of metal against polished floor echoed, sharp and unmusical. A ripple of discomfort ran through the onlookers, whispers rising like a current. But then she lifted her chin, and her eyes burned with something so fierce that the sound itself seemed to transform. It was no longer the clatter of imperfection. It was the drumbeat of resolve. Step by step, she advanced. The gown swayed with her movement, catching the light, refracting it like shattered stars. Each motion was measured, deliberate. There was no attempt to disguise the rhythm of her gait. She claimed it, owned it, turned it into part of the performance. Her body spoke a language older than fashion itself, one that whispered of survival and the raw, unfiltered dignity of refusing to yield. And something happened in the silence of the room. The smirks faded. The whispers died. Faces that once looked on with pity or mockery now softened, almost reverent. A tall model near the mirror, one who had earlier sneered, pressed her lips together and gave the smallest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one warrior to another. Another girl touched her heart unconsciously, as though she had just witnessed something too sacred to ignore. Adrian, who had built an empire on flawless silhouettes, felt a strange disturbance in the fortress of his certainty. His eyes, trained for decades to measure symmetry and perfection, could not look away. He wanted to see fragility, imbalance, the proof that his cruelty had been justified. But instead, he saw a flame steady, unbroken, burning in the girl's every step. The longer she walked, the clearer it became. She was not asking for a place in his world. She was declaring her existence, carving it into the air with every movement. The prosthetic leg, once an object of ridicule, now gleamed like armor. The halting rhythm of her stride, once considered a flaw, became a beat that resonated with the deepest instincts of those who watched. She was not pleading to belong. She was commanding the space around her to bear witness. There was no music, no runway lights, no grand stage. And yet, in that cramped backstage hall, it felt like the world had shifted. People held their breath, unable to look away. Some felt shame rise within them, shame for the way they had stared, for the cruel thoughts that had crept unspoken through their minds. Others felt a surge of something different, a kind of pride that had nothing to do with themselves, but with what they were witnessing. A courage so unadorned it redefined the word itself. Mai reached the end of the room and turned. Her gaze swept across the crowd, not challenging, not pleading, but steady, luminous. The satin of the gown caught her motion, flaring like firelight. She paused, her breath steady, her shoulders squared, and for a brief moment it was as if the world outside those walls did not exist. There was only this girl, this moment, and the undeniable truth that strength is not found in perfection, but in the audacity to rise when everything around you insists you should fall. Adrian's throat tightened. It had been years since he had felt anything on a runway other than control. He was the master of silhouettes, the architect of elegance, the ruthless gatekeeper of fashion's highest temple. And yet here he was, caught off guard, unsettled by the raw power radiating from someone who, by his own measure, should never have been allowed to stand under these lights. She took one final step forward, then stopped. The silence was deafening. The assistants and models, once mere spectators, now stood as if under a spell. For the first time that day, Adrian did not see a girl with a prosthetic leg. He did not see defiance or rebellion. He saw presence. He saw command. He saw something that no designer, however brilliant, could create with fabric or scissors or needle. What lingered was not pity. What lingered was all. The moment stretched, delicate as glass, and Adrian knew, though he would not admit it, not yet, that something within him had shifted. The fortress of arrogance he had built was no longer seamless. It had cracked, not because of argument, not because of rebellion, but because a girl who should have broken instead chose to burn. And in her fire he had glimpsed something he had long forgotten. Truth. The room exhaled as she lowered her gaze. her chin still high, and returned to the rack of gowns. No applause followed, no words were spoken, yet everyone present carried with them the weight of what they had just witnessed. For Adrian, it was not the end of a performance. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Mai had not won his approval, nor sought it. She had won something greater, the recognition of every soul in that room. That beauty, when stripped bare of pretense, is not about perfection at all. It is about the courage to stand, to walk, to claim your place even when the world says you cannot. And Adrian, for the first time in decades, felt the ground beneath him shift. Adrian remained rooted in place, though the air around him seemed suddenly heavy, as if the world had shifted by an inch and he alone had noticed. His gaze lingered on the girl who had just walked with such fierce dignity, but something in his mind had already pulled him far from the glittering chaos of the casting room. He was no longer seeing Mai, he was seeing someone else, someone long buried beneath the weight of his ambition and the relentless pursuit of perfection. His sister, her name, unspoken for years, floated into his consciousness like an echo. Clara, he remembered her not as a fragile being defined by her disability, but as a child with laughter that could brighten even the darkest corners of their small home. She had been born with a body that faltered where others did not, her legs weak and uneven, her balance uncertain. Yet she had dreamed bigger than anyone he knew. Dresses, fabrics, colors, her mind wove beauty long before he had learned to sketch a straight line. It was Clara who had first told him, as they sprawled on the floor with scraps of cloth, that fashion was not about rules. It was about freedom, about giving people wings when they could not fly. But Adrian, even as a boy, had wanted more than dreams. He wanted recognition. He wanted power. And in his hunger, he had learned quickly what the world rewarded: symmetry, polish, the illusion of flawlessness. He had built his empire on these values, closing his eyes to the memory of a sister who had asked him once if she might wear one of his gowns when he grew up to be a famous designer. He had laughed then, not out of cruelty, but from the raw belief that the world would never allow it. Fashion is for the perfect, he had said, dismissing her with the same merciless certainty he had shown to Mai just moments before. But Clara had never walked that runway. She never had the chance. Illness took her before she could see him succeed, before she could see the empire her encouragement had helped him imagine. And he had buried her memory beneath layers of silk and steel, building walls so high that even grief could not scale them. For decades, he had silenced the voice that once told him beauty belonged to everyone, not just the chosen few. Now, watching Mai's steady gaze, those walls cracked. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of Clara's unfulfilled dream. The defiance in her posture, the courage in her step. It was as if Clara had returned, demanding to know why her brother, the boy she had believed in, had betrayed the very essence of what she had taught him. Adrian's heart, usually so composed, twisted painfully in his chest. Memories flooded him with brutal clarity. Clara's hands smoothing over scraps of fabric, her whispered wish to feel beautiful for once, his cruel laugh that shut her down. The shame he thought he had buried now rose like a tide, and he realized that the arrogance he had perfected over the years was not armor, it was penance. He had spent his life demanding perfection from others because he could not forgive himself for denying his sister the simple dignity of being seen. He closed his eyes, but it did not block the image. Mai's figure blurred into Clara's, the young woman's prosthetic leg becoming the fragile frame of a girl who once stumbled across their living room, dreaming of gowns that shimmered like sunlight. For the first time in years, Adrian felt his throat tighten with something dangerously close to tears. He gripped the edge of a chair, steadying himself against a storm that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with the past. The room was still watching Mai, but Adrian was trapped in a different kind of performance, the one replaying in his mind. He remembered how Clara's death had fueled his obsession with control, how he had vowed never to let weakness dictate his destiny again. But control had come at a cost. He had stripped humanity out of his art, replacing it with statuesque precision. He had turned away from the very truth that his sister had embodied. That beauty was not perfection at all, but resilience. As he opened his eyes again, his vision sharpened. He no longer saw Mai as an intruder. He saw her as the embodiment of what Clara had once dreamed: to walk, to shine, to belong on a stage that did not discriminate. And in that realization, Adrian felt something inside him fracture. The fortress of his ego, built brick by brick across decades, was no longer indestructible. It was fragile, trembling under the weight of memory and truth. No one else in the room could sense the war raging inside him, but Adrian knew it. He knew that he stood at a precipice. He could choose to cling to his old beliefs, to dismiss this girl as an anomaly, a spectacle unworthy of his runway. Or he could acknowledge the ghost of his sister's dream, rising before him in flesh and fabric, demanding not pity but justice. And so, as Mai lowered her gaze but kept her shoulders squared, Adrian's heart whispered a confession he would not yet speak aloud. He had been wrong. Wrong to measure worth by symmetry. Wrong to deny his sister her place in the beauty she loved. Wrong to dismiss the girl who now stood as living proof that imperfection could outshine the flawless. The casting room slowly regained its hum, but Adrian was elsewhere, caught between past and present. For the first time in decades, he felt the stirrings of humility, and beneath the humility, something more dangerous: hope. The hope that perhaps it was not too late to honor Clara, not too late to rewrite the story he had once ruined, not too late to see fashion not as a prison of ideals, but as a sanctuary for courage. Mai had not spoken more than a handful of words, but she had awakened an entire world of memory within him, and in that awakening, Adrian understood. Her walk had not only challenged the room, it had resurrected his sister's voice, a voice he had silenced long ago, a voice now roaring back to life, demanding change. The arrogance that once defined him was faltering. The man who had stood so certain in his rules was now crumbling, undone not by failure, but by a memory wrapped in satin and courage. The room was still caught in silence when Adrian finally moved. For years he had been a man of precision, every gesture measured, every word sharpened like a blade. But now his steps felt heavy, uncertain, as if he were carrying the weight of something long buried. All eyes followed him as he crossed the floor toward Mai. Models straightened instinctively, assistants froze. Even the hum of backstage machinery seemed to dull beneath the gravity of his presence. Everyone expected another blow, another cruel dismissal that would seal the girl's fate. But Adrian did not look at her with disdain this time. His gaze, though still stern, carried something unfamiliar, something that unsettled even him. For the first time in decades, he was not seeing a candidate to be judged, but a truth he could no longer deny. Standing before her, his voice cut through the air, but the sharpness that once defined it was gone. "You don't need to fit the runway," he said, each word heavy, deliberate. "The runway must change to fit you." The sentence landed like an earthquake. Shock rippled across the room, so palpable that it seemed to rearrange the very air they were breathing. Assistants exchanged bewildered glances. Models blinked in disbelief. For them, Adrian's word had always been law, carved in stone, unyielding. To hear him bend even fracture was unthinkable. Mai stood very still. Her eyes searched his, trying to decipher whether this was mockery, another cruel twist meant to humiliate her further. But what she found there was something raw, unpolished, a man grappling with vulnerability, with regret, with the memory of a promise he had never kept. It was the faintest crack in his armor, but to Mai, it was enough. Adrian turned sharply to the room, his voice rising with the force of command that had built his empire. "Prepare her," he ordered, gesturing toward the racks of gowns and the startled makeup artists. "She will walk in tonight's show." Gasps followed, as audible as applause. No one spoke, but the silence itself was a chorus of disbelief. The thought was unthinkable. A girl with a prosthetic leg on one of the most exclusive runways in the world, under the spotlight that had only ever celebrated symmetry, perfection, and unattainable ideals. Yet Adrian's words allowed no argument. He had decreed it, and so it would be. Mai's chest rose with an unsteady breath. This was not the acceptance she had imagined, not a gentle invitation, but a sudden command, fierce and irrevocable. And yet it was real. For the first time in her life, somewhat of Adrian's power was not erasing her, but carving space for her to exist, to shine, to lead. Her pulse thundered in her ears, a symphony of terror and exhilaration. But she met his gaze without flinching. "You'll regret this," a voice muttered from the corner, an assistant shocked to hold his tongue. But Adrian did not even turn. He had spent years building walls of arrogance. Yet in this moment he chose to tear them down brick by brick, not for the world, not for his empire, but for the ghost of his sister and the living proof of my standing before him. He took a step back, his hand lifting slightly as if to signal her forward. "Show them," he said softly, almost a plea. "Show them what I failed to see." And with that, the tide shifted. The room, once heavy with ridicule, now vibrated with a strange electricity. Designers scurried to adjust fabrics, makeup artists rushed forward, and models, who once sneered, now stepped aside with quiet deference. The machinery of fashion, so rigid, so unforgiving, began to bend, to reconfigure itself around a single girl who had dared to ask for a chance. Hours later, as the lights of the main stage blazed to life and the audience waited with bated breath, the moment arrived. The curtains parted, the music swelled, and from the shadows, Mai stepped forward. Gasps erupted instantly. She did not hide her prosthetic. She did not disguise her stride. She owned it, letting the rhythm of her body dictate the flow of the gown she wore. Under the glare of thousands of eyes, she became something more than a model. She became a revelation. Adrian watched from the wings, his chest tight, his eyes fixed on every movement. He had seen countless shows, endless displays of elegance and beauty, but none had ever held him like this. None had ever broken him open the way this girl did with every perfect step. He felt the ghost of Clara in the room, watching through her, smiling in the way only she once could. The audience, stunned at first, soon erupted in applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the very rafters. They were not applauding out of pity. They were applauding because they had seen something: true beauty unshackled from convention, dignity born not of flawlessness, but of resilience. And Adrian, standing in the shadows, knew this was not just a bold decision for a single night. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a declaration to the world that fashion would never again be the same. He had taken the greatest risk of his career, not by pushing fabric to its limits, but by allowing himself to be human, to be wrong, and to be moved. And in that risk, he had found something far greater than perfection. He had found redemption. The night of the show ended not with silence, but with a storm. When Mai reached the end of the runway and turned beneath the blinding flood of lights, the audience rose to its feet as if compelled by something greater than applause. It was not politeness, nor was it shock. It was reverence. For the first time, many in that glittering hall realized they were not witnessing a performance at all, but a moment of truth carved into fabric and courage. Cameras flashed furiously, catching her gaze, her prosthetic gleaming like a declaration. Every step had spoken louder than any manifesto, and in those steps, something in the fashion world cracked wide open. Backstage, when the curtain fell, the air was heavy with disbelief. Assistants who had once whispered now stared at Mai as if she had walked out of legend. Models who had spent years chasing an impossible ideal looked at her with a respect they had not thought themselves capable of giving. And Adrian, usually the first to retreat to his private circle after a show, remained there among them, his eyes unblinking, his silence louder than any speech. For years he had sought to control the narrative, but tonight he had surrendered it. The press swarmed quickly. Reporters clamored with questions about the unexpected model, about the audacity of breaking convention. Adrian stepped forward, his posture as rigid as always, but the words that fell from his lips were unlike any he had spoken before. He did not defend his choice, nor did he diminish it as a stunt. He declared it as a beginning. He announced a new liner collection designed not for a fantasy of perfection, but for those whose bodies the industry had long ignored. Clothing adapted not to hide difference, but to celebrate it, to weave it into the fabric of beauty itself. This is not a favor, Adrian told them, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed the storm within. This is fashion returning to its true purpose, to reveal the dignity of the human spirit. The declaration landed like a lightning strike. Some in the industry gasped in admiration, others in outrage, but none could deny that something had shifted. The idea that difference could be reframed not as weakness, but as a new aesthetic frontier was radical, dangerous even. Yet in the echoes of applause still ringing from the show, it was undeniable, for Mai. The days that followed unfolded like a dream she had never dared to script. Invitations poured in from magazines that had once overlooked her. Headlines called her a symbol of resilience, a face that redefined beauty. Photographers who had dismissed her as unmarketable now begged to capture her image. She appeared on covers, her prosthetic never hidden, her stance always strong, a living contradiction to the industry's obsession with flawlessness. But Mai did not allow herself to be reduced to a symbol. She spoke with clarity whenever she was asked. "This is not about me alone," she told interviewers. "It's about the thousands who are told every day that they are not enough to be seen. Fashion is not only for the perfect. Fashion belongs to everyone who dares to stand in their own truth." Her words spread beyond fashion, resonating with those who had never cared for gowns or runways. She became more than a model. She became a voice. Adrian, too, was transformed. For a man who had spent his life sculpting an empire out of marble and glass, humility did not come easily. Yet each time he stood beside Mai, each time he unveiled sketches of garments designed for wheelchairs, for prosthetics, for bodies the industry had labelled unworthy, he felt something in him mend. It was not only his reputation he was repairing. It was a promise he had once broken to a sister who had dreamed of dresses she would never wear. Through Mai, he had found a way to keep that promise, not with words but with action. The impact was not immediate nor universal. Critics called it a gimmick. Investors warned him of risks. Old allies distanced themselves, unwilling to tarnish their brands with controversy. But Adrian pressed forward, not out of arrogance, but out of conviction. He had discovered that the true essence of fashion was not control but surrender, the surrender to authenticity, to humanity, to the courage of those who walked despite the world's attempts to stop them. Months later, the first collection under his new line was unveiled. The hall was filled again with light, with cameras, with the hum of expectation. But this time the runway was different. It was broader, adaptive, alive with variety. Models of every shape, every ability, every background took their turn. Some rolled forward in wheelchairs adorned with fabrics that shimmered like rivers of light. Others walked with prosthetics that had been transformed into art themselves, sculpted and painted to gleam with pride. The audience sat spellbound, not because of novelty, but because of the undeniable realization. This was beauty in its rawest, most unfiltered form, and at the heart of it all was Mai. Not hidden, not exceptionalized, but integrated. She walked with the same fire as before, but now her fire lit the path for others. She was no longer the anomaly Adrian had once mocked. She was the embodiment of a movement that refused to be silenced. When the applause rose at the end, it was different than before. It was not only admiration, but gratitude, a gratitude that someone had dared to open the gates, to widen the lens, to tell the world that fashion could be more than vanity, that it could be justice. Adrian stood quietly at the edge of the stage, watching not the fabrics or the lights, but the people. He saw Mai bow her head gracefully, saw the other models embrace one another, saw the audience on its feet. And he whispered words that no microphone caught, words meant only for himself and the ghost who had guided him here. Clara, this was for you. The story of Mai and Adrian did not end with a single show. It spread across continents, igniting conversations, shifting perspectives, planting seeds of change in industries far beyond fashion. Yet its essence remained simple, almost fragile. The belief that beauty is not the absence of flaws, but the presence of courage. And so, in a world obsessed with perfection, their message rang out like a clarion call. Fashion does not belong to the flawless. Fashion belongs to those who dare to walk, even when the world tells them they cannot. The story of Mai and Adrian is not just a tale about fashion, it is a story about the human spirit, about courage standing defiantly in the face of rejection, and about the power of one voice to change an entire system. In the beginning, Mai was simply a girl who dared to walk into a world that had already judged her unworthy. Adrian was a man hardened by pride, obsessed with perfection, and blind to the humanity that once inspired him. Their encounter was not gentle. It was sharp, painful, filled with words meant to wound. Yet, out of that clash arose something extraordinary. Mai's refusal to accept pity and her determination to walk became a mirror, forcing Adrian to confront his own buried grief and forgotten promises. What started as a humiliating dismissal evolved into a transformative moment both for Adrian personally and for the entire industry he represented. By choosing not to retreat, Mai not only claimed her place on the runway, but also redefined what beauty meant for millions watching. Adrian, in turn, found the courage to acknowledge his own failures and use his power to create change. Together, their stories shattered an illusion that perfection is the highest form of beauty, revealing instead that true beauty emerges from authenticity, resilience, and the audacity to keep walking forward despite obstacles. The lesson here is profound. Real transformation begins when we stop hiding from our imperfections and start embracing them as part of our unique story. Perfection does not inspire change, courage does. Mai's steps remind us that every weakness we think disqualifies us can become the very force that uplifts others. Adrian's awakening shows us that even the most rigid hearts can break open to growth. and that using influence to empower others is far greater than wielding it to control. In our own lives, the story invites us to look at the ways we dismiss ourselves or others because of differences or limitations. How often do we tell ourselves, "I don't belong," or look at someone else and assume they cannot rise? The truth is, every one of us carries scars, visible or invisible. And those scars are not signs of failure, they are proof of survival. When we accept them, honor them, and move forward with courage, we not only free ourselves, but also create space for others to do the same. So the next time you face rejection, remember Mai's walk. Remember that strength is not found in meeting impossible standards, but in daring to take a step when the world expects you to fall. The change we long to see, whether in our communities, workplaces, or families, often begins with that one step of courage. Now, let me ask you, if you had the power to redefine one standard in society, whether in beauty, work, or relationships, what would it be, and why? Please share your answer in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective, and others will too. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we have the motivation to continue bringing you more powerful stories like this one.